I had been planning this hike for months, carefully studying maps, reading guidebooks, and checking weather patterns. I wanted to escape the city, the constant hum of traffic and the never-ending deadlines. The trail I chose was in a remote mountainous region, the kind of place where cell service was scarce and the few hikers I might encounter were likely to be seasoned. I packed methodically. Enough food for 3 days, extra water, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, first aid supplies, a headlamp, matches, and my trusted backpack, the one that had carried me safely through many past trips. Everything was weighed, balanced, and tested. I was determined to be ready. I left the trailhead early in the morning, before the sun had even fully risen, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the dim pre-dawn fog. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wet earth and pine. Each step I took on the damp dirt path made a small crunching sound, and my breath came out in little clouds that disappeared almost instantly. The first few hours were relatively easy. The trail was well marked, with occasional wooden signs pointing toward the next landmark, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in my own competence. I was alone, but I liked the solitude. It allowed me to focus on my breathing, on the rhythm of my steps, on the way my muscles moved. The sun slowly rose, and the forest came alive with sound. Birds calling, leaves rustling in the wind, the occasional distant snap of a branch under the foot of an unseen animal. By late morning, the trail began to climb more sharply. My legs burned with exertion as I ascended, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I paused at a rocky outcrop to take in the view. Below, the valley stretched out, shrouded in a thin morning mist. It was breathtaking, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. I drank water, ate a small snack, and adjusted my backpack straps before continuing. The path soon narrowed, lined by dense underbrush that brushed against my arms with every step. Around midday, I reached a section where the trail forked, and the markings became less obvious. I had studied the map carefully, but in the forest, trails often diverged in ways maps couldn't perfectly capture. I took the path that seemed to match my notes. At first, it seemed fine, well-trodden if slightly overgrown, but after a while, I realized the markers had disappeared entirely. The forest thickened, sunlight barely penetrating the canopy above. I could hear the distant murmur of a stream, and I used that as a guide, thinking I could follow it to a clearer path. Hours passed. The terrain became more rugged. Rocks jutted out at odd angles, tree roots formed natural obstacles, and the ground was uneven and slippery. My feet ached, my knees protested, and the water in my bottles had begun to dwindle. The stream I had been following eventually forked, and I could no longer tell which direction would lead me back to the main trail. Panic, subtle at first, began to creep in. I stopped, sat on a large rock, and tried to calm myself, telling myself I was trained for this. I checked my compass and my map repeatedly, but the forest seemed to close in on me, each tree looking similar to the last, each path twisting unpredictably. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the forest seemed to change. Shadows grew long and heavy, the sunlight dimming into a muted gold. Every sound became sharper. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even the distant cries of birds, so sharp that I jumped at my own footsteps. I knew that descending into panic would only make things worse, so I focused on breathing, moving slowly, keeping my senses alert. The sky was shifting rapidly from gold to deep orange to dusky purple, and I realized I had underestimated the time it would take to find a secure spot to camp. By nightfall, I was exhausted. My legs shook as I searched for a flat, safe area to pitch my tent. The ground was uneven, covered in rocks, roots, and thick layers of moss. Every step required caution, every movement required attention. Eventually, I found a small clearing, just enough for my tent. I set it up quickly, double-checking that the stakes were secure. I could hear the distant sound of running water, the wind brushing through the trees, and the occasional rustle that could have been an animal or my imagination. My heart pounded with the awareness of how isolated I truly was. I ate a small meal, drank sparingly, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was cold, colder than I had anticipated. My body ached, my muscles stiffened, and the shadows outside the tent seemed to shift in subtle, almost hypnotic ways. I forced myself to sleep, knowing that I would need strength for the next day. Sleep came fitfully. Every snap of a twig outside made me flinch. Every gust of wind rattled the tent in a way that made me wonder what had caused it. Morning brought no relief. I woke stiff, my neck sore from sleeping awkwardly. I packed my tent and supplies, but as I began to retrace what I thought was the main trail, I realized I had no clear sense of direction. The trees looked the same. The trail markers I had relied on were nowhere to be found. My water supply was low, and I had eaten the last of my snacks. Anxiety settled in with a physical weight pressing on my chest. I forced myself to move, keeping in mind what I had learned in survival courses. Maintain calm, ration supplies, conserve energy, stay alert, and keep moving. Hours passed. I stumbled over roots, slipped on mossy rocks, and nearly fell several times. The sun rose high, burning through the trees in harsh patches, and I could feel the heat on my back. My throat was dry, my mouth parched, but I had to prioritize walking over drinking too much water at once. I scanned the forest constantly for any sign of a path, a landmark, anything that could guide me back. Occasionally, I thought I heard voices, but the wind carried sounds strangely, and I realized it was probably just echoes, animals, or my own imagination. By late afternoon, fatigue began to hit in waves. My muscles burned, my vision blurred slightly, and I had to stop frequently to rest. I realized that if I didn't find the trail soon, I would have to consider staying put and rationing my remaining water and food until I could be rescued or until I could move safely. I examined my compass again. According to it, I had been walking roughly north for most of the day. The map suggested that if I continued north, I would eventually reach a logging road, which could lead me to civilization. I pushed on. Each step felt heavier than the last, but the knowledge that stopping could be dangerous kept me moving. As evening approached, the light faded quickly. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and every small sound seemed amplified. I found a small ridge and climbed it, hoping that from higher ground I could spot something useful. When I reached the top, I saw it. A narrow dirt road winding through the trees, barely visible through the thinning branches. Relief surged through me, so powerful I felt tears prick my eyes. I descended carefully, taking deliberate steps to avoid twisting an ankle or slipping. When I reached the road, my legs were trembling, my clothes soaked with sweat and dirt. I began walking along it, hoping to find a sign of life. A vehicle, a house, another person. The road was empty, silent except for the wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. I moved slowly but steadily, aware that my pace was uneven due to exhaustion. Night began to fall again, but now I felt a surge of determination. The road was man-made, and if I kept following it, it would lead somewhere. By late evening, I saw headlights in the distance. My heart leapt. I waved my arms, shouted, and even tried a flashlight I had kept in my pocket. The car slowed, pulled over, and the driver stepped out. Relief hit me in waves. I explained my situation briefly, showing them my map and compass. They offered water and called for assistance on a radio, alerting authorities that I was lost but now safe. Eventually, a team arrived to escort me back to the trailhead. They were professional, calm, and methodical. I felt weak and exhausted, but overwhelmingly grateful. They carried some of my gear, helped me navigate the final stretches, and offered guidance on hydration and rest. By the time we reached the main trailhead, I was trembling from a mixture of fatigue, relief, and adrenaline. I had been alone, lost, and completely exposed to the wilderness, but I had made it back. That night, I sat in my car, drinking water and eating a simple meal, my legs still aching, my hands trembling slightly. I reflected on the hike, the beauty of the forest, the danger, the fear, and the lessons it had taught me. I had underestimated the forest's scale, the difficulty of navigating without clear markers, and the importance of preparation beyond just equipment. I knew I had been lucky. Luck, careful planning, and survival knowledge had all played a role in keeping me alive. In the end, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The experience had been terrifying, exhausting. I had always loved hiking, the way the world changed when you left behind roads and houses, the smell of wet soil and pine, the quiet weight of the forest pressing down on you in a way that made city life seem distant and unreal. It was early September when I set out on a solo trip to the northern trails near the highlands. The air was cool in the morning, with the faintest trace of frost clinging to the grass, and the sky a muted gray, promising rain later in the day. I had packed carefully, double-checking my gear, my backpack heavy with water, a first aid kit, some high-energy snacks, a map, and a compass. I had always been cautious, always thorough. The forest could be beautiful, but it could also be unforgiving if you weren't prepared. The trail began gently, winding through thick stands of fir and birch. The ground was soft under my boots, covered with a thin layer of fallen leaves. At first, it was easy, almost comforting. Birds flitted in the branches above, and the occasional chipmunk scurried across the path. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became, until it was little more than a dirt track, overgrown with roots and brambles. My legs ached slightly, but I welcomed it. Hiking was always meant to be a challenge. I had done longer trails before, but this one had a reputation for being tricky in its isolation. Most people only attempted it in groups. By mid-morning, I reached a small clearing where a stream cut across the path. The water was clear and cold, tumbling over rocks, and I crouched to fill my water bottle. My boots sank slightly into the soft soil near the bank, and I was careful not to slip. I noticed a faint set of footprints on the opposite bank, older tracks, partly washed out, leading deeper into the forest. I thought little of it. People passed through these trails all the time. Still, a small unease tugged at the back of my mind. It was easy to dismiss when you were used to solitude, but something about being entirely alone in the wilderness always made your senses sharper. The trail climbed steadily after the clearing, steepening as it wound up the side of a ridge. Trees thinned, replaced by patches of exposed rock and hardy shrubs clinging to the slope. I paused frequently, both for breath and to enjoy the view. Below, the forest stretched endlessly, a vast sea of green with the occasional flash of brown or silver where the sun caught a distant river. The wind picked up here, cold and persistent, and I zipped my jacket, pulling the hood tight around my face. There was a sound in the wind that made me uneasy. Not the wind itself, but a low, dragging noise, like fabric scraping over rock, faint but distinct. I stopped to listen, holding my breath, and then it was gone. Probably a branch or a loose boulder, I told myself. I had learned not to give in to fear when alone in the forest. Fear had a way of making the small things grow large. Around midday, I reached the top of the ridge. From here, the path would descend sharply into a valley where the trail became notorious for mudslides and slick rocks. I ate a small lunch, careful to secure my food so as not to attract wildlife. While I was eating, I noticed another set of tracks, fresh this time, leading off the trail and into a thicket of dense underbrush. They were large, booted, human. Someone had been here recently. I felt the familiar prickle of unease, the one that warned me to stay alert. There was no one in sight, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant rush of a waterfall down in the valley. I drank some water, checked my compass, and headed down. The descent was slower than I expected. Loose gravel and wet leaves made every step precarious, and I had to move carefully, planting my boots deliberately to avoid slipping. My knees protested, the strain of the climb catching up to me. As I neared the bottom, the forest thickened again, dark and oppressive despite the afternoon sun struggling through the canopy. The path here was uneven, riddled with roots, and I had to focus intently to avoid twisting an ankle. I could hear the stream from before, now louder, tumbling over rocks with a steady roar. It gave me a sense of direction, something stable amidst the disorienting forest. I stopped to rest on a fallen log, my backpack heavy and my shirt damp with sweat. That's when I noticed something else. A piece of bright orange fabric caught in a bush just a few feet from the trail. It looked like part of a jacket, maybe from a hiker. My pulse quickened. It was worn and snagged, as though the person had moved through in a hurry. I examined it carefully, turning it over in my hands. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing immediately alarming, but the placement bothered me. People didn't usually leave their jackets behind. I stuffed it into my pack. It was probably a lost item, but I made a mental note to stay extra alert. The next few hours were tense. The trail became almost unrecognizable at times, the path overgrown, the ground slippery with mud. I could hear the wind through the trees, a constant whisper, and the occasional snap of a branch that made me jump. As evening approached, the forest darkened, the sun dipping below the ridges, and I realized that I had misjudged my pace. I was farther from my intended campsite than I had hoped. I stopped, checking my map by the fading light. My phone had no signal as expected. I could see the river in the distance, a ribbon of silver through the valley. If I kept heading downhill, I could probably reach it by nightfall, but the thought of navigating unfamiliar, steep terrain in near darkness made my stomach tighten. I pressed on, moving more cautiously, testing each foothold before shifting my weight. It was slow going, and the forest seemed to grow more menacing with every step. The shadows of the trees stretched long and dark, and the rustling of animals that had been distant now felt close, almost surrounding me. My senses were on high alert, every sound amplified. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, but it vanished when I turned my head. I told myself it was fatigue and imagination, the forest playing tricks as it often did on those who wandered too long alone. Hours passed, and the path became increasingly treacherous. Rocks slick with moss, tangled roots, and steep drops made every step a test of balance and attention. I began to hear the distant sound of voices, or maybe it was just the wind echoing oddly through the valley. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowed. I could see the glint of something metallic ahead, half buried in the mud. It was a carabiner used for climbing or securing gear, abandoned. I picked it up, examining it. No markings, no clues. It was a minor detail, but it reinforced the sense that I was not alone in this part of the trail. Someone else had been here recently, and I had no idea whether they were still around. Night fell quickly. The forest transformed under the darkness, the familiar path now a maze of shadows and shapes. I switched on my headlamp, its beam cutting a narrow swath through the blackness. The sound of the river grew louder, which was a relief. It was a guide of sorts, but the terrain was brutal. Muddy slopes, jagged rocks, and fallen trees slowed my progress. At one point, I slipped, catching myself on a tree just before a steep drop. My heart raced, my palms slick with sweat and mud. I sat down on a rock, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. I told myself to keep moving. Staying in one place was dangerous, too, because you never knew what might come by in the dark. As I descended further, I came across a narrow, steep ravine with no clear way down. The map indicated that the trail went this way, but the path was completely washed out. I examined the slope, looking for safe footholds. The drop was treacherous, and my pack made balancing difficult. I realized that any misstep could result in serious injury, or worse. I weighed my options carefully, considering climbing down slowly versus backtracking to find another route. The forest around me was silent, except for the constant roar of the river below. Every shadow looked like a threat, every branch a potential hazard. I took a deep breath and decided to attempt the descent, placing each foot carefully, feeling for stability with my trekking pole. Took what felt like hours, but eventually, I reached the bottom. My legs were trembling, scraped, and bruised, but I was safe. The river was right in front of me now, wider than I expected, and I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead to a trail or road. The terrain was still rough, fallen trees, rocks, and sudden dips, but the presence of the water gave me a sense of direction and purpose. I had to keep moving. I forced myself to drink water, to eat the small snack I had left, and to focus on each step. The riverbank was muddy and uneven, my boots slipping with every stride, but I pressed on. Several hours later, I began to see signs of human activity. Broken branches, footprints, and eventually the faint glow of distant lights through the trees. My heart lifted. I was close to civilization. Exhausted and battered, I had planned this hike for weeks, carefully studying maps and trail reviews, packing my gear meticulously, and making sure I had enough food, water, and emergency supplies to last at least 2 days longer than I expected to be out. The trail started off easy enough, winding gently through the forest with sunlight filtering through the leaves, and birds chirping somewhere high above in the canopy. The air was crisp, but not cold, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. I felt that familiar rush of excitement and calm, the one I always felt when I knew I was alone in the woods but prepared for anything. As I walked, I kept an eye on the trail markers. I had chosen a less traveled path, the kind people warned about for being quiet, isolated, and sometimes tricky to navigate. My plan was to reach a ridge where I could see the valley spread out below, take a few photos, rest, and then loop back to the trailhead before nightfall. The first few hours passed without incident. The trail was uneven in places, roots and rocks threatening to trip me if I wasn't careful. But I moved at a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water or take a small snack. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a section of the trail where the trees thinned, giving glimpses of the mountains around me. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling through the sparse leaves and carrying a sharper, colder scent. I noticed some animal tracks in the dirt, probably deer, but one set of prints was unusual. They were larger, deeper, and didn't match the hoofed pattern of the others. For a moment, I considered turning back, but I rationalized it. Maybe a large dog or a stray from a nearby cabin. I continued, trying not to think too much about it. The trail began to climb more steeply, and I could feel the strain in my legs and lungs. I paused at a rock outcrop to catch my breath and take in the view. From here, the valley stretched out like a patchwork quilt of green and brown, a river threading through it like silver. I took a few photos, then started up again, checking my watch. I was still ahead of schedule, but I could feel the afternoon slipping away. That's when I noticed it. A faint sound, almost like a rustle, off the trail to my right. At first, I thought it was the wind moving the trees, but then I heard it again. A snapping of twigs, deliberate and slow. I froze, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound came from deeper in the woods, but something about it made me tense. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't random, it was deliberate. Something was moving carefully, watching me. I considered taking a different path or retracing my steps, but the trail narrowed, and turning back would be slow. My backpack felt heavier with anxiety now, every sound amplified. The snapping continued intermittently, always coming from the right side, never from behind me, never from the left. My mind ran through possibilities. Bear, wolf, or even a human. I told myself the last was unlikely, but that thought didn't make me feel any better. I tried to move quietly, keeping my pace steady, and constantly checking my surroundings. The trail wound around a bend, and I thought maybe I had lost whatever it was following me. I paused at a bend and crouched slightly, scanning the trees. The sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, and shadows lengthened, making everything look darker, more menacing. And then I saw it, movement, just a flicker, a shadow among the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Panic began to creep in. I thought about calling for help, but my phone's signal was weak, almost non-existent. I had a whistle, I had a small first aid kit, and I had some emergency rations. But I also knew that panic could make things worse. I forced myself to slow my breathing and think clearly. The trail ahead seemed to climb a ridge that could give me a vantage point. If I could reach it, maybe I could see if I was truly alone or if someone or something was following me. I started moving again, faster this time, but trying to stay quiet. The snapping continued behind me, closer now. My heart was pounding, and my legs burned, but I forced myself to stay focused. Every step felt heavy, every breath loud in my own ears. When the trail turned sharply and I could see the ridge above, I scrambled up the last few meters of loose dirt and rocks, finally reaching the crest. From the ridge, I could see a larger expanse of the forest below. The shadows stretched long, and the light was fading quickly. I scanned the trees where I had seen movement. For a moment, I thought I was alone. Then I noticed a figure, crouched low, half hidden behind a tree, watching me. My mind went into overdrive. A human, someone who had been following me. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself to think logically. I was on higher ground now, which gave me an advantage. I slowly reached for my whistle, planning to make noise if the person tried to approach. The figure moved again, disappearing briefly behind a cluster of trees. I realized that staying there could be dangerous. I needed to get to a place where I could safely signal for help, or at least be closer to the main trail where someone might pass. I turned and started moving along the ridge, staying close to the edge but trying to keep cover with rocks and trees. The figure followed at a distance, careful not to make obvious noise, just like me. Every step was tense, every glance backward sending a jolt of fear through me. I knew I couldn't outrun someone for long in this terrain if they were determined. My best chance was to outsmart them, to use the environment. The trail dropped sharply on the other side of the ridge, leading down to a small clearing where a creek ran. I decided to head there. Water would slow down anyone following, and the sound of the creek might mask my movements. I descended carefully, stepping over roots and loose rocks, trying not to slip. My hands were scraped and dirty, my clothes damp with sweat, but adrenaline kept me moving. As I reached the clearing, I saw a small footbridge over the creek. I crossed it carefully, scanning the trees behind me. The figure was there, watching from the edge of the clearing, but they didn't approach the water. I realized then that they were hesitant, maybe unsure about following me into a more exposed area. That gave me a small but crucial advantage. I kept moving along the creek, hoping to reach a campsite I had passed earlier on my map. My mind raced, considering every possible outcome. I had some rope and my small multi-tool. I could climb trees if necessary. I could hide if I had to. Every instinct was telling me to stay alert, to not let fear control me. The creek led to a larger path, one that would eventually connect to the main trail. My pace quickened, and I stayed low when possible, using the terrain for cover. I could hear the snapping behind me again, but it was slower now. The figure was hesitant, probably realizing I was aware of their presence and unwilling to make a direct approach. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 45 minutes, I reached the main trail. It was wider, more open, and I knew hikers occasionally used it. I could see signs of recent footprints, maybe a few hours old, leading in the direction of the trailhead. Relief began to wash over me, but I kept moving cautiously, keeping an eye on the trees around me. After a long, tense walk along the trail, I saw something that made my heart finally settle. Another hiker, a man carrying a backpack and walking with a confident pace. I didn't need to explain anything. The sight of another human who could potentially help was enough. I waved my arms and shouted, loud and clear. He looked in my direction immediately, and I could see the recognition in his eyes. He hurried over, and I explained my situation as best I could without words, pointing toward the area where the figure had been following me. We moved together back to the trailhead, staying alert but much calmer with another person beside me. By the time we reached the parking area, the sun had almost fully set, and the woods seemed less threatening in the fading light. We reported the encounter to the local rangers. They checked the area and advised me on precautions for future hikes. I left the forest that day exhausted, shaken, but relieved. I realized how quickly a day that started with calm excitement could turn into a fight to stay safe. The experience taught me to trust my instincts, to plan for the unexpected, and to respect not just the natural hazards of the wilderness, but the human ones too. I still hiked after that day, but I never underestimated the importance of vigilance, preparedness, and the knowledge that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones you don't see coming. I remember the morning I decided to go hiking like it was yesterday, though it has been years. The sun had barely risen, and the air was still crisp with the kind of cold that makes your lungs tighten and your breath visible in little clouds. I had been wanting to hike this trail for months, a stretch that wound deep into the mountains, known among locals for its isolation and natural beauty. It was not a trail for beginners, and I wasn't exactly experienced, but I had done enough hikes to feel comfortable. I packed my bag the night before: water, some granola bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra socks, a light jacket, and a map I had printed from an online guide. I checked the weather multiple times. It was supposed to be clear, and I left my phone fully charged, though I knew signal would be spotty deep in the mountains. The beginning of the hike was easy. The trailhead started at the edge of a small forest, where pine trees rose tall and straight, and the undergrowth was thick but passable. The ground was covered in a mixture of fallen leaves and pine needles, which cushioned my steps but also made it easy to slip if I wasn't careful. Birds chirped, the wind whispered through the branches, and I felt that familiar mix of excitement and calm that always comes with entering the wilderness. I started my hike early to avoid the afternoon sun and to give myself plenty of time to return before nightfall. For the first 2 hours, the trail was well marked and mostly level. I passed a small creek where water ran clear over smooth stones, and I stopped briefly to drink and wash my face, enjoying the cold rush against my skin. The sun had risen higher by then, and patches of light filtered through the trees, making the forest glow in warm golds and greens. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful, and I felt that unspoken sense of ease hikers get when everything seems perfect. The trouble began when I reached a fork in the trail. According to the map, both paths would eventually lead back together, but one was labeled as more advanced, winding steeply upward along a rocky incline. I decided to take it, mostly because I liked the idea of a challenge and the promise of a better view. I started the ascent slowly, careful with each step. The trail narrowed, roots and rocks jutting out in dangerous angles, and I had to pay close attention to avoid twisting an ankle or losing my footing. My legs began to burn from the climb, and sweat dampened my shirt despite the cool air. A few hours in, I reached a ridge that offered a stunning view. I stopped to catch my breath and admire the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. The valley below was blanketed in trees, with a river snaking through it like a silver thread. I drank some water and ate a granola bar, feeling proud of myself for making it this far. But I also noticed that the trail beyond the ridge became less distinct. The markings on trees were faded, the path narrower, and rocks and fallen branches began to obscure the route. I brushed it off as normal. Trails in remote areas were rarely maintained, after all. As I continued, the forest changed. The trees grew denser, the light dimmed, and a thick layer of moss covered rocks and trunks. The trail became almost invisible at times, forcing me to climb over fallen logs and navigate slippery slopes. The map indicated that I was still on course, but I realized that I couldn't see the kind of landmarks that helped me orient myself. My phone had no signal, and the GPS was inaccurate, showing me off the path at strange angles. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself to trust my instincts and follow the terrain as best I could. Around mid-afternoon, I encountered a section where the trail disappeared entirely. I thought I could find a way through, but the ground became unstable. Loose gravel covered the slopes, and every step risked a slip. I paused, weighing my options, and realized that turning back would be safer than trying to forge ahead blindly. The thought of retracing my steps was daunting, but I knew it was better than risking a fall. As I began the descent, the situation worsened. My legs were tired from the climb, and my balance was off. The trail that had seemed manageable on the way up now felt treacherous. At one point, I misjudged a step and slid a few feet down a slope, catching myself on a tree just in time. My heart raced, my hands were scraped and bleeding, and I felt a wave of panic I hadn't expected. I realized how dangerous the hike had become, and the illusion of safety I had felt earlier evaporated entirely. Hours passed as I carefully made my way down. I stopped frequently to rest, eat, and drink, knowing I needed energy to keep moving. The light began to fade faster than I expected. The dense forest blocked much of the remaining sunlight, and shadows stretched unnaturally, making it difficult to judge distances and depth. I switched on my flashlight, grateful for the small beam of light cutting through the darkness. My anxiety grew, but I reminded myself to stay calm and move deliberately. At some point, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. The trail markings were nowhere in sight, and the terrain looked unfamiliar. Panic set in more strongly now. I was not only in the dark but also lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Fallen trees, rocky slopes, and dense undergrowth made it impossible to find the path I had taken earlier. My phone still had no signal and the battery was draining fast. I forced myself to slow down, breathing deeply, trying to think logically. I remembered the creek I had passed earlier. If I could find water, I might be able to follow it downstream and eventually reach a larger trail or road. I searched for the sound of running water, straining my ears in the dark. Eventually, I heard the faint gurgle of a stream. I moved cautiously toward it, careful not to slip on the wet rocks. The creek was small, but it provided a sense of direction. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me somewhere familiar. The night deepened, and the forest became colder. The creek twisted through thick brush, and I had to crawl over rocks and squeeze between trees. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant animal calls, made my heart jump. I kept reminding myself that most animals would avoid humans and that my focus needed to stay on moving forward safely. My flashlight flickered occasionally, adding to the tension, and I realized I would need to conserve its battery for emergencies. Several hours later, I saw a faint light in the distance. My heart leapt. It was either a reflection from the moon or a sign of human presence. I pressed on carefully, hoping it was a campsite or ranger station. The light grew stronger, revealing a small clearing with a dirt path leading out of the woods. Relief washed over me. I emerged onto the path, exhausted, muddy, and scratched from branches, but safe. I could see tire tracks on the dirt road and knew it connected to the main trailhead I had started from. I walked along the road until I finally reached a spot with cell signal. I called for help, simply to let someone know I was okay, and then continued at a slower pace until I saw lights from parked cars near the trail entrance. I collapsed into a bench, exhausted, feeling the full weight of what had happened. I was shaken but alive. I had underestimated the trail, the terrain, and the isolation of the area. The experience left me with a deep respect for the wilderness and the need for preparation, caution, and humility. In the following days, I reflected on what had happened. I realized that hiking was not just a physical challenge, but a mental one as well. The mountains could be beautiful and serene, but they were also unforgiving. One wrong step, one misjudgment, and the consequences could be severe. I learned to respect maps, to prepare for the unexpected, and to recognize the signs of danger before they became crises. I returned home with a stronger understanding of myself. The hike had been terrifying at moments, but it also reinforced my resilience and ability to stay calm under pressure. I shared my story with friends and fellow hikers, not as a cautionary tale to scare them, but as a reminder to take wilderness safety seriously. Every time I think back to that hike, I remember the feeling of the cold air, the sound of the creek, the shadows of the trees, and the way I had forced myself to keep moving when everything seemed uncertain. I survived because I stayed aware, remained calm, and trusted my instincts. And from that day forward, I never underestimated the mountains again. I had always enjoyed hiking alone, especially in late autumn when the forest seemed quiet and the air crisp. There was something satisfying about the solitude, the sound of my boots crunching over leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, and the smell of wet earth mixed with pine. I planned my hikes carefully, studied the maps, and carried extra food, water, and survival gear. But this day would test more than just my preparedness. I started early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the distant ridges. My destination was a remote loop trail I had read about in a small guidebook, a trail that promised a view of a deep valley from a ridge that few hikers ventured to. The path began easily, a dirt track winding through low trees, but I soon realized that the trail had not been maintained much. Leaves covered most of the markers, and fallen branches forced me to step carefully. I enjoyed the challenge at first, moving deliberately, listening to the wind rustling the treetops. By mid-morning, I had reached a section where the trail narrowed between steep inclines. One side dropped sharply into a shallow ravine, while the other rose into a rocky slope. I had to watch my footing carefully. A misstep could easily lead to injury. The forest here was dense, the canopy almost closed, letting through only scattered beams of sunlight that created strange shadows on the ground. I noticed small signs of wildlife, scat, claw marks on trees, broken twigs, but nothing that felt threatening. Still, there was a quiet intensity in the air, a tension I could not explain. I took a brief break at a small clearing, sitting on a moss-covered rock. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying a chill that seeped through my jacket. I drank water slowly and ate a small snack, checking my map again. The trail was supposed to loop around and reconnect further down, but the markers were so faded I had to rely more on the terrain. I decided to follow what looked like the path most traveled by animals, hoping it would lead me in the right direction. As I continued, the trail became less clear. I had to climb over several fallen logs and navigate patches of thick underbrush. At one point, I slipped on a damp patch of soil, scraping my hand on a rock. I paused, cleaned the small cut with water, and applied a bandage from my first aid kit. The adrenaline of a minor accident made me more alert. I reminded myself that the forest, while beautiful, could be unforgiving if I was careless. Around noon, I reached a small stream cutting across the trail. I had to carefully step on slippery stones to cross it, testing each one before putting my full weight down. The water was cold, clear, and fast-moving. I took a moment to appreciate the sight, noticing how the sunlight reflected off the surface, creating bright streaks. As I focused on the stream, I did not immediately notice the strange set of footprints in the mud along the bank. They were fresh and deep, larger than mine, with a noticeable dragging pattern, as if the person or animal had been carrying something heavy. I felt a twinge of unease but quickly dismissed it, assuming a hunter or hiker had passed through recently. I crossed carefully and continued, telling myself the forest was quiet for a reason. Most people avoided these back trails because they were difficult, but the feeling persisted. I noticed how the air seemed heavier here, almost stagnant, despite the wind rustling the trees above. Every small noise, the splash of water, the snap of a twig, felt amplified. By mid-afternoon, the trail started to climb steeply. The incline was exhausting, and I had to pause frequently, leaning on my trekking poles. My legs burned from the effort. My breathing came in heavy gasps, and sweat dampened the collar of my jacket despite the chill. The forest had changed. The trees were taller, their roots exposed and twisting across the path. Moss and lichen covered every rock, making the ground treacherous. As I climbed higher, I realized I had lost sight of any trail markers. The path I thought was correct seemed to split repeatedly, and every choice looked equally plausible. I stopped to check my map and compass. According to the topography, the ridge I wanted should be just ahead, but the forest was dense and visibility was low. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting long shadows. I made a decision to continue upward, reasoning that even if I could not reach the exact viewpoint, I could find a safer place to rest before dark. An hour later, I stumbled upon what looked like a small clearing, partially overgrown with bushes and fallen trees. I decided to use this spot to catch my breath and consider my options. Sitting on a log, I drank water and examined my gear. I realized I had underestimated the difficulty of this trail. My legs were tired, my hands scraped, and a dull ache had started in my ankle from a misstep earlier. As I rested, I noticed something unusual. The clearing had signs of human activity: discarded food wrappers, a small, makeshift fire ring, and a faint trail of footprints leading deeper into the forest. I felt a moment of curiosity, mixed with caution. Someone had clearly been here recently. I scanned the surrounding trees and underbrush. The forest was quiet, but the quiet felt oppressive. I decided to investigate the faint path briefly, thinking it might reconnect with the main trail. I followed the trail for a few minutes, my boots sinking slightly into damp soil. The footprints were deeper here, the drag marks more pronounced. I realized with a growing sense of unease that they did not appear to be normal hiking footprints. There was an irregularity in the way the soles pressed into the mud, as if someone had stumbled or carried something heavy for an extended distance. The forest seemed to close in, the trees forming a canopy that blocked out the sky almost entirely. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the kind that comes from an instinctive warning rather than logic. I debated turning back, but as I did, I heard it, a faint rustling behind me. I froze, straining my ears. It stopped. I waited, and then there it was again, closer this time. The sound was deliberate, heavy, and careful, like someone moving quietly but with purpose. My heart rate jumped. I had been alone all day, but suddenly I felt watched. I considered calling for help on my phone, but I had poor reception in this dense forest. The rational part of my mind reminded me that animals could make these noises, but the pattern was different, almost human. I made a decision to move back toward the clearing and retrace my steps carefully. I stayed alert, scanning every shadow and listening to every movement. The forest, once calming and serene, now felt threatening. Every branch snapping underfoot sounded like it might announce my presence to whoever or whatever was following. My backpack felt heavier than before, and my adrenaline surged, sharpening my focus. As I descended slightly toward the clearing, I noticed fresh broken branches along my intended path. Someone had been moving through this area recently, perhaps following the same trail. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed a plan. I examined my surroundings carefully. The small clearing offered temporary visibility, but it was not defensible. The trail I had used earlier was steep and difficult but led downward toward the stream and eventually to the main trail. I decided my best chance was to move quickly but cautiously down the slope. I began descending, placing each foot carefully to avoid slipping. The forest grew darker as the afternoon waned. The rustling continued intermittently behind me, always stopping when I paused. I told myself to remain quiet, to avoid making unnecessary noise, but the fear made my movements more tense and deliberate. I tried to remember the markers from earlier, using large rocks and distinctive trees as reference points. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the stream again. I recognized the crossing from the morning and felt a surge of relief. I carefully stepped across the slippery stones, glancing back toward the forest behind me. Nothing appeared to follow, but the unease did not lift. I continued along the path that would lead back to the main trail. Finally, as twilight approached, I emerged from the dense forest into a more open area. The trail became clearer, the markers easier to see. I could see the faint outline of the ridge I had intended to reach in the distance, but the sun was now low, and I knew I would not make it to the summit safely before dark. I decided to set up a temporary camp in a small flat area near the trail, collecting dry leaves and small twigs to create a fire. I checked my supplies, made sure my water was accessible, and kept my backpack close as I built a small fire. The fire crackled to life, sending warmth into my chilled body. I felt safer, more in control, but the tension of the day lingered. I stayed alert, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the distant call of a bird, the rustling of small animals, the occasional snap of a branch, but nothing approached my camp. I ate a small meal from my pack, keeping the fire going as a precaution. Morning brought clarity and relief. I woke to the sound of birds. I remember waking up that morning with a sharp chill in the air, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones even before your body is fully awake. The sun had barely started to rise, casting pale streaks of light through the curtains of my small cabin rental near the edge of the forest. I had been planning this hike for months, carefully mapping out the trails, checking the weather, making sure I had the right gear. The plan was simple: start early, reach the summit of the ridge by afternoon, and return before dusk. I packed my bag with meticulous care: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, compass, flashlight, extra layers, and my hiking boots, which I had broken in over the past few weeks to avoid blisters. My backpack felt heavy, but I carried it easily enough, excited and tense at the same time. The trailhead was a short drive from the cabin, and I parked my car at the small dirt lot. There were no other cars. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and damp soil. I could hear the faint rush of a creek nearby. I tightened the straps of my backpack and took my first steps on the trail. The path was narrow, overgrown in some sections, and already damp from the morning dew. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth, and each step made the faint rustle of fallen leaves and twigs underfoot. At first, it was quiet in that sort of peaceful way that feels almost sacred, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the forest is holding its breath. Birds chirped occasionally, high in the treetops, and somewhere far away a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against a trunk. As I climbed, the trail began to incline sharply. My legs burned quickly, a dull ache that settled into my thighs and calves, but the rhythm of walking kept me moving. I passed moss-covered rocks and the occasional tree stump that looked like it had been there for decades. The forest grew thicker as I ascended. Sunlight barely reached the forest floor through the dense canopy above, and the air felt cooler, damper, heavier somehow. I was careful with each step, watching for roots and loose stones, aware that a twisted ankle or worse could ruin everything. After a couple of hours, I reached a small plateau. I paused, set my pack down, and took a drink of water. Looking around, I realized how isolated I truly was. The valley below was blanketed in mist, the trees stretching out like a green sea in every direction. For a moment, it was breathtaking. I decided to press on toward the ridge. The trail narrowed, winding around steep drops and jagged rocks. Here, the path was almost invisible in places, hidden by fallen leaves and pine needles. I had to grip tree roots and rocks to steady myself. My hands were soon scraped and dirty, but I hardly noticed. I was entirely focused on where I was putting my feet. The forest was quiet again, but this time there was a different kind of quiet. It was heavier, more oppressive, as if I were intruding on something ancient and untouched. My heart beat faster than it should have for the pace I was walking, and a prickling sensation ran down the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things. About 3 hours into the hike, I came across the first real obstacle. A fallen tree blocked the path, its roots exposed and twisting like gnarled fingers. I climbed over it carefully, making sure my footing was solid, and landed on the other side with a soft grunt. My legs were trembling slightly now, fatigue settling in. I sat briefly on a rock to rest, sipping more water and trying to eat some of the trail mix I had brought. My pack felt heavier, every movement more taxing, but I forced myself to keep moving. I knew I couldn't afford to stop for too long. Time was a factor. I had calculated that I would need at least 4 hours to reach the ridge, and I had no desire to hike back in the dark. As I continued, the terrain became even more rugged. The trail twisted and turned along the side of a steep hill, the earth loose and crumbly in places. I found myself occasionally sliding a little, catching myself on rocks or tree trunks. I had to concentrate intensely, calculating every movement, testing each foothold before putting my full weight on it. Sweat ran down my back, dampening my shirt, and my legs burned with the effort. I had been hiking for hours, but there was no way to turn back easily. The trail behind me had become obscured by bends and undergrowth. Around midday, I reached a section of the trail that climbed directly up a rocky slope. It was exposed with a sharp drop to my right. I gripped the rough stone with both hands, pulling myself upward, each movement slow and deliberate. My legs were shaking with exertion, but I ignored it, pushing upward step by step. Every now and then, a small stone would slip beneath my hand or foot, sending a jolt of panic through me. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay calm, and not rush. The sun was now high overhead, casting bright light on patches of moss and stone, and I could feel the warmth on my shoulders, which contrasted sharply with the cool, shaded areas beneath the trees. I finally reached a flatter section near the top, a narrow ledge that ran along the side of the hill. Here, I took another long break, sitting with my back against a boulder, looking out over the steep drop and the winding trail far below. My legs felt like jelly, trembling uncontrollably as I rested. I checked my water supply. Less than half remained, and I realized that I had eaten almost all my snacks. I felt a wave of anxiety. I had planned to return before dark, but the pace had been slower than expected, and the trail was far more challenging than I had anticipated. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I couldn't afford panic. Not here, not now. It was around this point that I first noticed something unusual: the faint smell of smoke. At first, I thought it might be from a distant campfire, but it was so faint, so unusual, that it made my skin crawl. There was no other hiker in sight, no clearings or trails nearby. The smoke wasn't constant. It would appear for a few seconds, then vanish, only to return again. My instincts told me to pay attention. Something was wrong. I scanned the ridge and the valley below, looking for signs of fire or human activity. There was nothing, no tents, no flickering lights, no signs of movement. Just the forest, still and silent. I forced myself to continue. The trail became a mixture of loose rocks and dirt, winding sharply along steep inclines. My legs screamed with fatigue. My hands were scraped and aching from gripping rocks and roots, and my breath came in short, harsh bursts. But I pressed on. I knew that if I stopped for too long, or if I lost focus, I could easily slip or fall. The fear in me was no longer just about getting lost. It was the sharp, primal fear of the terrain itself. The steep slopes, the unstable ground, the isolation. It all weighed heavily on me. I felt a cold sweat forming along my back and neck, my heart hammering in my chest. About an hour later, I reached a small saddle between two peaks. From here, I could see the ridge I was aiming for in the distance. It was a long stretch, but at least the path appeared more stable. I adjusted my backpack, taking a moment to wipe sweat from my eyes, and I started moving again. The sun had started to dip slightly, and I realized I might not reach the top and return before dusk if I didn't pick up the pace. My muscles protested, every step a test of endurance, but I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, keeping my balance and breathing steadily. That's when I first heard it, a faint but distinct cracking of wood. I froze instantly, my body tense. I scanned the surrounding forest, but it was empty. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by another snap. I couldn't see anything, but the noises were too deliberate, too close to be natural. My heart leapt into my throat. I considered turning back, but the idea of retracing my steps along these treacherous slopes was terrifying. I kept moving, faster now, every sense on high alert. The sounds followed, intermittent, always just behind me, like someone or something was moving through the forest, tracking me. My pace quickened, adrenaline pumping through my body, but I had to be careful. The path was uneven, rocks loose under my boots, roots jutting out unpredictably. I stumbled once, caught myself against a boulder, and cursed under my breath. My hands and knees were scraped, blood mixing with dirt. The sounds in the forest persisted, but they seemed to keep their distance, never revealing themselves fully. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker, maybe an animal, but the sound pattern didn't match anything I had experienced before. By late afternoon, I finally reached the base of the ridge proper. The climb now became vertical in places with jagged rocks and narrow ledges. My muscles screamed with exhaustion, but the thought of stopping and possibly being trapped here overnight pushed me onward. I found a large boulder to rest behind, catching my breath, eating the last of my trail mix, and drinking the final sips of water. My hands shook, my arms ached from gripping the rocks, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The forest around me was silent. I remember the morning like it happened yesterday, even though it has been months. The sky was still a soft gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that promised rain but never delivered quickly. I had woken earlier than usual, around 4:30 in the morning, because I was excited about the hike. I had been planning this trip for weeks, poring over maps, reading about the trails, studying every contour and elevation change. I wanted to push myself this time, to see the wild sections that most casual hikers avoided. The trailhead I picked was remote, tucked far from the main roads, in a section of the forest few ventured into, and part of me was thrilled at the thought that I would likely not encounter another person for hours, maybe even all day. The air was damp and smelled like wet soil and pine. I loaded my pack carefully, making sure to distribute weight evenly, and double-checked my gear. I had my usual essentials: water, snacks, first aid kit, map, compass, flashlight, spare batteries. I even carried a small emergency bivvy, something I rarely used but felt reassured by. I put on my boots, worn but well broken in, and felt the familiar tightness around my ankles. I had hiked long enough to know that proper boots could save you from injuries, blisters, or worse. I tightened the laces, swung my pack over my shoulders, and started down the narrow dirt road that led to the trailhead. The first part of the hike was easy. The trail wound through thick pine forest, the needles underfoot soft and muffling. The air was cold, but my body quickly warmed up as I climbed the gentle inclines. Birds began their morning songs, high-pitched notes bouncing through the trees. Every so often, I would spot a squirrel darting across the trail or a flash of a deer moving in the distance. The forest felt alive, peaceful in a way that always reassured me at the beginning of a hike. I had been hiking for about an hour when I reached a fork in the trail. The left path looked well-trodden, used often, with signs of previous hikers, footprints in the soft mud, scattered bits of litter, a few broken branches marking the way. The right path, however, was narrower, overgrown, and steep. My heart picked up when I looked at it. This was exactly what I had been looking for. The less traveled trail promised solitude and challenge. I double-checked my map. According to the topo lines, the path climbed sharply before leveling out near a ridge that offered views I had only seen in pictures. I swallowed hard, adjusted my pack, and turned right. Immediately, the trail became steeper, rougher. Roots protruded like wooden teeth, and slick patches of mud threatened to pull my boots from under me. I moved slowly, deliberately, testing every foothold. My breathing grew heavier, not just from the exertion but also from the tension that always comes when the trail narrows and you know you are venturing into less known territory. The forest here was darker, older. The trees were thick, trunks covered in moss, and the canopy closed overhead, filtering the early morning light into dim, green shadows. The birds had stopped singing. As I climbed higher, the trail became almost invisible in places. I found myself brushing branches aside and stepping over fallen logs. I paused frequently, consulting my map and compass, making sure I had not veered off course. At one point, I realized I had left a small cairn I had been following behind me, suggesting someone had tried to mark the path. I wondered briefly who else had walked this way and how long ago. It did not feel threatening, just empty, isolated. But that isolation carried weight in itself, a pressure in the quiet that made me hyper-aware of every sound. A snapped twig, a rustling leaf, even the distant sound of running water made me pause and scan the shadows. By late morning, I had climbed considerably higher. My legs were burning, and my shirt stuck to my back from sweat, but I was exhilarated. The trail began to level slightly, and I noticed the first signs of human interference in the area. An old, rusted metal pipe sticking out from the hillside, a faded piece of cloth caught in a bush. It felt almost like a marker from the past, a reminder that people had been here before, though not recently. The air was cooler now, the wind picking up along exposed sections. Clouds began to thicken, and the sky shifted from gray to a dull, almost white brightness, signaling that rain could come at any moment. I ignored it for the time being, focusing on the trail ahead. It was around midday when I reached the ridge. The view was breathtaking. I could see the forest stretching endlessly below me, a sea of green broken only by the occasional gray of rocky outcrops. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, leaning against a large rock, pulling out my water bottle, and taking slow, deep sips. I took a few pictures with my phone, careful not to drop it over the edge. The ridge was narrow, and the drop-offs on either side were steep. I reminded myself to stay cautious, feeling a shiver run down my spine from both the height and the wind gusts that rattled through the pines. After 20 minutes of rest, I moved onward. The trail started to descend, gradually at first, then more sharply. That is when the first real trouble began. The soil on the path was wet, almost slick, and the roots were exposed and slick with moisture. I misjudged a step, and my boot slipped, sending me scrambling to catch myself against a tree trunk. My heart raced as I steadied myself, but the slip had been a warning. I slowed my pace, careful with every footfall. The forest grew denser again, the trail narrowing to barely a footpath. The trees pressed in from both sides, and the light dimmed as the sun was hidden behind clouds. I noticed that the sound of the wind had changed, no longer just gusts in the treetops, but a faint, constant whisper of movement in the underbrush. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just small animals or branches moving, but a sense of unease had begun to settle in my stomach. My breathing became shallow, not just from exertion, but from a growing awareness that I was alone, truly alone, in an area that very few people ventured into. About an hour later, I stumbled upon a section of the trail that had been washed out. Heavy rains in recent days had torn the path, leaving a steep, muddy slope with rocks and roots jutting out dangerously. My first instinct was to turn back, but I realized that retracing my steps would be difficult. The path had narrowed, and I could not see the ridge clearly from behind me due to thick foliage. I weighed my options carefully. Going forward seemed risky, but staying put was not practical either. I decided to proceed cautiously. I tested each step before committing my weight, sliding my boot carefully along rocks, roots, and mud. A misstep here could have sent me tumbling down the hillside. My palms were sweaty, my muscles tense. I moved slowly, sometimes crawling on hands and knees to maintain balance. At one point, my foot slipped, and I caught myself just in time with my hand grabbing a tree root. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst in my chest. I took a long moment to sit on a nearby boulder, calming myself, drinking water, and trying to steady my trembling hands. As I continued down the slope, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were footprints in the mud, larger than mine, clearly human and fresh. I froze. They moved in the same direction I was going. My first thought was relief. Someone else had passed here recently. But the deeper I looked, the more uneasy I felt. The prints were uneven, hurried, and at times doubled back in ways that did not make sense. There was no pattern, no orderly progression. I felt my chest tighten. Something about them felt off, and I could not explain why. I debated whether to follow them or move away from them, but the slope left little room to maneuver. I continued, staying alert to every sound. The forest around me began to change. Trees grew larger and more gnarled, the undergrowth thickened, and visibility dropped to mere feet ahead. The slope became a ravine, steep on both sides, and the path twisted unpredictably. My footing was treacherous, and the mud made every step uncertain. The prints continued, always ahead, sometimes disappearing only to reappear a few meters down the trail. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a hiker with a heavy pack or someone exploring the same route, but a nagging sense of dread kept me from feeling comfortable. Hours passed. I kept moving, careful, exhausted, and increasingly anxious. The sky grew darker, clouds thickening to a steel gray, and the wind picked up, whistling through the trees with a low, eerie moan. My pack felt heavier with every step. My legs burned, my feet ached, and my hands were scraped and muddy from gripping roots and rocks. I tried to keep my mind focused on the trail, on each step, on staying safe, but the isolation and uncertainty gnawed at me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the bushes, made me flinch. Then I heard it, a sound unmistakable in its intensity. A branch snapped sharply nearby, close enough that my heart leapt into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. There was no wind strong enough to cause that. I had been planning this hike for months. It wasn't just any hike. It was one of those long, solitary treks deep into a mountainous area I had never explored before. I had spent days studying maps, checking satellite images, and even reading trip reports from other hikers who had attempted this route. My backpack was packed with the essentials: Extra layers of clothing, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for several days, a first aid kit, a headlamp, a small stove, and a detailed map and compass. I told myself that preparation was everything when it came to hiking alone in remote areas, but nothing could prepare me for what was about to happen. I started early in the morning, the air crisp with the lingering chill of the night. The parking lot was empty except for one other car, which I assumed belonged to another hiker. I felt a slight twinge of unease, but I shrugged it off. I had hiked alone before, and there was something liberating about being completely by myself, away from the constant noise and people of the city. I began the trail on solid ground, a wide dirt path that wound gently through the forest. The trees were tall and dense, their branches forming a green canopy above, filtering the sunlight into soft, shifting patterns on the ground. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and leaves. It was beautiful, and I felt my excitement rise. At first, the hike was straightforward. I followed the trail markers closely, checking my map regularly. I noticed the sound of birdsong and the distant rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I paused several times to take photographs of the scenery, the way the sunlight fell through the trees, the way moss clung to rocks and tree trunks. After a few hours, the trail began to incline more steeply. I was in good shape, and I welcomed the challenge. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air seemed, and the cooler the temperature became. My water bottle was already half empty, but I knew I had enough for the day. I stopped at a small clearing to rest, drinking and eating a snack, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Everything was going according to plan, but soon things began to change. The trail, which had been clearly marked and well-worn, started to narrow and become less distinct. I could no longer see the red and white markers that had guided me so far. The trees grew closer together, and fallen branches and rocks made progress slower. I reminded myself to stay calm and check the map. According to my calculations, I was still on course, but I realized I hadn't seen another hiker for hours. The silence, which had been peaceful before, now felt oppressive. The sound of my own breathing and footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. A small knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I tried to shake it off. I was experienced, I told myself. I had handled rough terrain before. The afternoon passed, and the sun started to dip toward the horizon. Shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I realized I needed to find a suitable place to camp soon, or I would risk hiking in darkness. I scanned the area, looking for a flat patch of ground, preferably near a water source. After about an hour of searching, I found a small clearing with relatively flat ground and a shallow stream nearby. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. I set up my tent, spread out my sleeping bag, and boiled water for dinner. As I ate, I listened carefully to the forest, noticing things I hadn't earlier. The occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of an animal. It was normal, I reminded myself, but I still felt a subtle tension in the back of my mind. That night, I slept lightly. The forest was alive with sound, more so than I remembered in previous hikes. There were moments when the rustling seemed deliberate, as if something was moving closer. I tried to convince myself it was just deer or raccoons, but sleep was difficult. I woke several times, each time listening intently. Once, I heard a crunch of leaves nearby, and my heart skipped a beat. I didn't move, didn't call out, just waited. After a few tense minutes, the sound faded. I tried to return to sleep, but a feeling of being watched lingered. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I needed to make progress before the afternoon, but I also wanted to get to a more familiar section of the trail before darkness fell again. I followed the stream, reasoning that streams often lead to wider trails or eventually to roads. But as the hours passed, I realized I had been walking in circles. The terrain was confusing, the forest thick, and landmarks I thought I recognized seemed to shift. Panic started to creep in. I stopped, sat down, and examined my map. I was certain I had started near a main trailhead, but now I had no idea where I was. The stream I had been following didn't appear on my map. It wasn't marked. By midday, my water was running low, and my food supply was minimal. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual this far into the wilderness. but the reality of being alone and disoriented began to hit me. I considered trying to climb to higher ground to get my bearings. It was risky, but staying put wasn't an option either. I chose a ridge that looked promising. The climb was exhausting. The terrain was uneven and slippery from recent rain. I had to be careful with every step. Once on top, I scanned the forest around me, trying to find a recognizable landmark or any sign of a trail. All I saw was dense forest in every direction, stretching as far as my eyes could reach. As the afternoon wore on, the sun sank lower. The shadows of the trees grew long, and the temperature dropped. I realized I had underestimated the time it would take to navigate this section. I began to feel the first real pangs of fear, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your stomach churn. The rational part of my mind told me to stay calm, to remember my survival training, to conserve energy. But the instinctive part, the one that knows when danger is near, screamed at me that something was wrong. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. Then I heard it, a snapping sound, not far from where I stood. It was deliberate, not like a falling branch or a small animal. I froze, straining to listen. Another snap followed, closer this time. I realized that I wasn't alone. My mind raced through possibilities. Another hiker, a hunter, maybe even a bear. I didn't hear any growling, no footsteps on soft earth. But the sound of breaking twigs continued intermittently. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I needed to find shelter, or at least conceal myself. I moved quietly toward a cluster of thick trees, hoping to make it without drawing attention. Hours seemed to pass as I carefully navigated the forest. Every sound made me jump. Once, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. I realized I had wandered off the stream and the ridge and had no idea where I was again. My water was nearly gone, and I was exhausted from both fear and exertion. Darkness was falling fast, and I had no choice but to stop and set up my tent in an uneven clearing. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to suffice. I barely slept, listening to every sound, muscles tensed, ready to react to anything. By the third day, I was running low on supplies. My food was down to a single protein bar, and my water bottle had just a sip left. I knew I needed to find my way out. I had learned from experience that panicking or wandering aimlessly could make things much worse. I remembered reading that streams often lead to roads or trails. With a deep breath, I decided to follow the stream I had left behind, hoping it would lead me somewhere recognizable. Every step was slow, careful, and deliberate. The terrain was rough, the forest thick, and I slipped and stumbled several times. My legs were covered in scratches, and my hands had minor cuts from gripping branches. Mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A faint trail, overgrown but present. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Relief washed over me. I checked the map, and it seemed this trail could connect me to a main path if I followed it long enough. My pace quickened, but I reminded myself to stay cautious. The forest had a way of tricking you into false hope. I followed the trail, noting every bend and tree that looked distinctive. Hours passed, and the trail wound through valleys and ridges, but it was consistent. I began to see signs of human activity: an old campsite, rusted cans, footprints that might have been from months ago. It was a good sign. As evening approached, I heard the sound of running water, larger than the stream I had been following. I followed it and found a wider river, and on the far side, a well-worn path. My heart leapt. I crossed carefully, using rocks to balance, and reached the trail. There were footprints here, more recent. It was clear people used this trail. I followed it, exhausted but determined. Soon, I saw a small wooden sign marking the main trailhead. Tears came to my eyes as relief hit me. I had made it. I kept walking until I reached the parking lot. There was a small group of hikers there. They looked surprised to see me, a lone figure, disheveled. I had always loved hiking, the quiet of the woods, the steady rhythm of my boots against dirt and stone, the smell of wet pine and earth after a rain. I had been hiking for years, always prepared, always cautious. always aware of the small dangers hidden in nature. But I had never experienced anything like what I went through that weekend. I thought I knew what fear was, and I thought I understood being alone. I had no idea. It started on a Friday morning in early September. The weather had been hot all week, and I wanted one last long hike before the fall really set in. I packed my usual gear: water, a few granola bars, my small first aid kit, extra socks, my compass, map, flashlight, and a sturdy pocket knife I always kept on my belt. I didn't bring a tent because I planned to return before nightfall. The hike I chose was in a range of mountains I knew fairly well, with a trail that was moderate but long. I parked my car in the small dirt lot at the trailhead and started walking just after sunrise, feeling the cool air on my skin and the morning sun breaking through the trees. The first few miles were easy, the trail wide and clear. Birds chirped in the trees, and I passed the occasional hiker going in the opposite direction. There were small streams I crossed carefully on rocks, their water clear and cold, and I refilled my water bottle at one of them. By late morning, the trail became narrower and steeper. Pine trees crowded the path, their roots twisting across the dirt, making it easy to trip if I didn't watch. I loved this part, the quiet except for the wind through the trees and the occasional distant bird. I felt alive and calm, the way hiking always made me feel, until I reached a junction that I didn't immediately recognize. I paused to check my map. The trail split, one path leading up toward a ridge I had been on before, the other curving down into a dense valley I had never explored. The ridge trail looked familiar and safe, but something in me wanted to explore the valley, just for a change, just to see something new. It was a choice I would come to regret. I marked the trail on my map and took the valley path, thinking it would only add an hour or two to my hike before reconnecting to the main trail. The beginning of the valley trail was quiet and cool, the trees taller, the undergrowth thicker. I could hear water running somewhere nearby, maybe a creek or a small river, and I followed the faint sound as I walked. The trail quickly became less maintained. Branches and small fallen trees blocked the path, forcing me to step over or around them. The further I went, the fewer signs of human presence I saw. No footprints, no litter, no blazes painted on trees. At first, I thought this was normal. I had read that some of the lesser-used trails weren't maintained regularly. But after an hour, I realized something was off. The trail markers I had seen before were gone entirely. The small path that had been visible at first was turning into little more than a faint impression in the dirt. I stopped and looked at my map, trying to get my bearings. The valley had a small creek running through it, and I could see the path roughly following it, but the trail itself seemed to vanish and reappear in sections. I considered turning back, but something made me push forward. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe pride, maybe just stubbornness. I followed the creek, stepping carefully over rocks and through shallow water where the path had disappeared completely. After another hour, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were taller, older, and darker. Their thick canopy blocked most of the sunlight, and the air felt colder and damper. I noticed that the wind had stopped. The forest was unnaturally still. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, just the faint sound of the creek trickling over rocks. Then I saw the first sign of real trouble. A large branch had fallen across the creek, partially submerged, and when I stepped onto it, it shifted under my weight. I caught myself, heart racing, and realized the ground around the creek was uneven and slippery. Mud clung to my boots, and every step felt precarious. I had been walking for almost 2 hours down this valley, and I was still following only the faintest suggestion of a trail. My legs were tired, my hands scratched from branches, and I could feel the tension building in my shoulders. I told myself to stay calm, to focus, to watch my footing. About 30 minutes later, I reached a part of the creek that widened and deepened. There was no way across except to wade through the water, which was cold and fast-moving. I hesitated. I had hiked through streams before, but this one looked deeper than I was comfortable with. I tested the water with my boot, and it came up past my ankle. I would have to go higher. I took a deep breath and stepped in. The current was stronger than I expected. Water rushed around my legs, pulling at me slightly, and I carefully made my way to a large, flat rock in the middle. That's when I realized I had lost the trail completely. There was no path on the other side, just thick undergrowth and trees so dense that it looked like a wall of green. I tried to see my map, but the dense forest made it hard to orient myself. I walked along the creek, hoping to find a crossing or a sign of a trail, but the creek turned and curved, the water rising slightly from the recent rain upstream, and there were no clear markers anywhere. I began to feel the first real fear of the day, not from animals or danger in the abstract, but from the knowledge that I could get lost. I looked at my watch. I had been hiking for over 4 hours, and I was still far from any familiar trail. The sun was high in the sky, but the thick trees made it feel dim. I tried to retrace my steps in my mind, thinking of the branches I had stepped over, the rocks I had crossed, the direction of the creek. Everything looked similar. Everything was green and brown and shifting. My heart started to pound, a tight, heavy thumping in my chest. I knew panic would make me careless, so I stopped, sat on a rock, and tried to breathe. I took out my water, drank slowly, and forced my mind to think. I decided to climb higher. The creek seemed to be running downhill, so if I could get to higher ground, I might be able to see something, maybe a ridge or a clearing or even a hint of the trail. I began to climb. The slope was steep, covered in loose dirt, rocks, and thick roots. Every step had to be careful, and I used my hands to grab branches for support. My legs burned, my arms ached, and I slipped once, landing on my side, scraping my shoulder and hip on rocks. I cursed under my breath, but I got up and kept going. The forest seemed endless. Hours passed. I lost track of time as the day wore on. My energy was fading, my water supply was getting low, and I had eaten only a small snack. I kept climbing, following no real trail, just moving upward, hoping to see something that looked familiar. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. It wasn't big, maybe 10 feet across, surrounded by trees on all sides, but it was enough for me to look around. I could see the tops of distant ridges, maybe a mile or more away. I thought I saw a faint line of a trail down one of the ridges. It was hard to tell, and I wasn't certain if it was real or just the angle of the sunlight and the shapes of the trees. But I knew I had to move. Staying put in that valley would be worse. I decided to try to make my way toward that ridge. I kept moving, using all my strength and careful footing. The slope was relentless. Loose rocks shifted under my weight, tree roots tore at my boots, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. My hands were cut and bleeding slightly from branches and rocks, but I kept going. I reminded myself that this was survival now. I had hiked in difficult terrain before, but this was beyond anything I had ever done. Late in the afternoon, I finally reached the top of a small ridge. From there, I could see more clearly. Below me, the valley stretched out, the creek winding through it like a silver ribbon. I saw no trail there, no sign of any other hiker. But on the far side, another ridge had what looked like the main trail cutting through it. It was faint but unmistakable. My relief was immediate, but I knew getting there wouldn't be easy. The ridge I was on was steep, and the path down would require careful climbing and balance. I started down the slope, moving slowly and deliberately. Every step had to be measured. My legs shook with exhaustion. My arms were scraped and sore, and my water was nearly gone. I had to stop several times to rest, leaning against trees and catching my breath. Sunlight was fading, and shadows grew long, but I pressed on. By the time I reached the base of the ridge, I could see the main trail clearly. It wasn't a dramatic trail, just a narrow path cutting through the forest, but it was enough. I felt tears of relief sting my eyes. I had done it. I followed the trail back to the parking lot slowly, my pace cautious because I was tired and sore. The sun had nearly set when I finally saw my car. I collapsed into the driver's seat, exhausted, muddy, scratched, dehydrated, and trembling. I sat there for a long time, breathing, drinking water, and trying to calm my racing heart. I had never felt fear like that before. Not fear of a bear or falling. I had always thought of myself as careful, someone who planned thoroughly before attempting anything remotely adventurous. Hiking was supposed to be my release, a way to escape the constant stress of work and the cramped life in the city. I liked to believe I knew what I was getting into, that my backpack, my supplies, and my careful research were enough to carry me through the wilderness safely. But I was wrong. That summer morning, I left my apartment with my gear neatly packed and my plan mapped out, thinking the trail I was heading toward was straightforward and familiar, marked well on all the maps and in several guidebooks I had read. I underestimated the wilderness in ways I could not have predicted, in ways that left me with a fear that was raw, physical, and unavoidable. The trail started like any other. It ran through a thin strip of forest before opening into a wide valley, the kind that looked like a postcard from the road. I noticed how quiet it was, but it was the kind of quiet I liked. Peaceful, not eerie. I had hiked alone before and never had a problem, always telling myself that being alone made the experience more intimate, more connected with the earth. I checked my backpack: water, snacks, a first aid kit, my map, compass, flashlight, and emergency blanket. Everything was in order. The sky was clear, no hint of rain, and the temperature was perfect. As I walked, I tried to take note of the trail markers, even though I was familiar with the map. The markers were small, painted rectangles on trees every few hundred meters. I passed one without noticing at first, thinking I was on a straight path. Soon, the trail began to narrow, becoming less maintained, and the forest seemed denser. The air grew thicker with humidity, and a low hum of insects surrounded me. Birds chirped occasionally, but there was no other sound. No other hikers, no rustling in the distance. Nothing but the soft crunch of my boots on the soil and dry leaves. About 3 hours in, the sun had climbed higher and cast long shadows between the trees. I came to a small stream, shallow but fast-moving, cutting through the forest floor. I had planned to rest and refill my water bottle. I knelt beside the stream, carefully scooping water into my bottle and filtering it with my portable filter. I ate a small snack, a granola bar and some dried fruit, and leaned back against a tree, closing my eyes for a few moments. There was an odd stillness in the forest around me. Not a threatening stillness, but a silent watchfulness that made my skin tingle. I shrugged it off. Being alert was part of hiking. I continued on the trail, which became less obvious as time went on. The markers grew farther apart, and I had to double-check my map and compass to make sure I was still on course. The forest thickened, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. Every so often, I had to scramble over a large fallen tree or step carefully around a dense patch of brush. My pace slowed, but I was confident. I was experienced enough to know that patience and caution were far more important than speed. After several more hours, I came to a ridge that overlooked a steep slope descending into another valley. The view was breathtaking. Green trees stretched out for miles, interrupted by small streams and the occasional rocky outcrop. I paused to take photos, marveling at how quiet and untouched it seemed. I had planned to rest here for a while and then descend into the valley, where I could pick up the next section of the trail. That's when I noticed it, the faint sound of movement, not from the forest floor but above me. I looked up and saw nothing at first, just the canopy swaying slightly. Then I heard a snap, a branch breaking somewhere above, and my pulse quickened. My rational mind told me it was probably an animal, a deer, or maybe a small bear. I had my bear spray in my pack but hadn't needed it yet. I moved cautiously, scanning the trees, listening intently. I could hear branches creaking as if something heavy was moving above me, but the sound didn't resemble the rustling of a small animal. It was deliberate, slow, and measured. I tried to calm myself. "Stay calm," I muttered silently, adjusting my pack. "It's probably nothing." But my heart was racing. I considered turning back, retracing my steps to the safer, lower parts of the trail, but I knew it would take hours to return to the parking lot at this point. I decided to continue, moving more carefully now, staying aware of the sounds above. The trail led me along the ridge for nearly an hour before descending into the valley. The descent was steep, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks and roots. My legs burned, my palms scraped, but I kept going. I kept listening, alert for any sign of movement. Occasionally, I heard the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but every time I looked up, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself that my imagination was playing tricks on me, that the forest was simply full of normal sounds amplified by the silence and isolation. By late afternoon, I reached the bottom of the valley. The trail opened slightly, and I could see the path winding through the trees, though it was narrow and overgrown. I had been hiking for nearly 6 hours straight, and fatigue had begun to settle in. My water was low, my legs ached, and the shadows were lengthening. I paused to drink and catch my breath, sitting on a fallen log. The air was cooler here, and I could smell the damp earth and moss. The forest seemed alive, but it had changed. The earlier calmness had shifted into something heavier, more oppressive, though I could not identify why. I continued, my steps slower now, paying close attention to every sound. That's when I heard it again, the deliberate crack of a branch, this time closer. I froze. The sound came from the right side of the trail, among the trees and underbrush. My first instinct was to climb a tree or move to higher ground, but the terrain didn't allow it. I reached for my phone to check the time, but the battery indicator flashed low. I had relied on it mostly for GPS, which meant I now had to depend entirely on my compass and map. Then I saw it. Movement, a shadow shifting quickly among the trees. Not a deer, not a bear, something humanoid. My heart jumped, adrenaline flooding through me. I couldn't see clearly, but the movement was too deliberate, too intentional to be an animal. I tightened my grip on the walking stick I had brought, knowing that any encounter could be dangerous. I told myself to stay calm, to think rationally. If it was another hiker, maybe they were lost or startled. But my gut told me otherwise. I tried to move silently, keeping low and using the trees for cover. The figure seemed to follow my movements, always just at the edge of my vision. I realized then that the forest I had trusted was no longer neutral. It had become a maze, a place where I could be observed, but had no clear way to defend myself. I had to reach the river that I knew ran through the valley. Water and a clear path along the bank could offer a safer route out. I navigated carefully, avoiding dry leaves and snapping twigs. Every time I glanced behind me, I caught the faintest hint of movement. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to rationalize the fear gnawing at me, but there was no comfort. The sun was dropping lower, and shadows were lengthening, making the forest darker and more difficult to see through. My pace quickened, but I had to stay quiet. A misstep could reveal my position. Hours passed. I moved cautiously, stopping frequently to listen, to watch. My legs were stiff, my lungs burning, my water nearly gone. The forest around me felt like it was closing in, the trees pressing together, the undergrowth tangling my feet. I stumbled over a root and fell hard, scraping my knee and elbow. Pain shot through me, but I couldn't stop. The figure, whatever it was, seemed to sense weakness. I felt eyes on me constantly, even when I couldn't see anyone. Eventually, I reached the river. It was wider than I had expected, moving swiftly but steadily. I could follow it downstream to the main trail, which would lead me back to civilization. Relief flooded through me, but I kept moving cautiously, stepping from rock to rock, careful not to slip. The sound of water was comforting, masking other noises, providing a rhythm to my steps. I followed the river for hours, my mind alternately focused on each careful step and on the fear gnawing at me. I lost count of how many times I slipped or stumbled, my backpack catching on branches, my boots sliding on wet rocks. My energy was nearly gone, but I pushed forward, driven by a combination of fear and determination. Just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I saw the faint outline of a trail marker across the riverbank. My heart leapt. I had made it back to the trail. I scrambled across a shallow section of the river and stumbled onto the path, my legs shaking with exhaustion. Relief and disbelief mixed in me. I could see the trail leading toward a dirt road that I remembered from the map, and I knew that once I reached it, I would be safe. By the time I reached the road, darkness had fully settled. I could see headlights approaching in the distance. I waved my arms, signaling to the driver, and they slowed down, pulling over. I had been planning this hike for months, researching the trail, checking maps, and gathering all the gear I thought I would need. It was supposed to be a solo trip into the remote hills north of the city, a long weekend away from everything: people, noise, responsibilities. I wanted nothing but the feeling of walking through the wilderness, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the wind brushing against my face. I had been on plenty of hikes before, but this one was going to be different. It was longer, more isolated, and far less traveled. The trailhead started at the end of a rough dirt road that seemed to fade into the forest almost immediately, and my car struggled through the potholes until I finally parked near a broken wooden sign that had faded so much you could barely read the words. I double-checked my pack, making sure my water, food, first aid kit, map, compass, and flashlight were all in place. My boots were snug, my jacket tied, and my heart was already pumping from the excitement and nervousness that only comes from going somewhere no one else is likely to be. The first few hours of the hike were exactly what I had hoped for. A slow climb up the side of the hills, the trees thick and green around me, sunlight filtering in spots through the canopy above, birds calling in the distance. The trail was mostly a dirt path with exposed roots and scattered rocks, and I had to keep my eyes down to avoid twisting an ankle. There were occasional markers, small painted symbols on trees, but they were infrequent, and soon I realized that if I wanted to continue safely, I would have to keep the map and compass out at all times. I had practiced using both, but I still felt a small pang of doubt as I looked around at how uniform everything looked. After about 3 hours of climbing, I found a small clearing with a stream running through it. I knelt down to drink, letting the cold water run over my hands, then filled my bottle and took a snack. The sound of the stream was comforting, and I thought for a moment about how this could be a good spot to rest if I needed to set up camp, though it was still early in the day. I continued hiking after a short break. The trail began to rise more steeply, and the trees became denser. I passed broken branches and piles of fallen leaves that smelled earthy and damp. The light shifted quickly as the afternoon wore on, and I realized I was already deep into the woods, the trail barely visible in places. I checked my compass and map again, making sure I hadn't veered off course. Everything seemed fine. I thought about how easy it would be to get lost if I wasn't careful, but I felt confident. I had hiked in remote areas before, and I knew the signs to look for, like tracks in the dirt or breaks in the foliage that indicated a path. Still, there was an edge of unease creeping into my mind. The forest seemed unusually quiet, not the comfortable quiet of nature, where you can hear the birds and the wind, but a thick, almost oppressive quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every now and then, I would hear a twig snap far off, and my heart would jump, only to calm when I realized it was probably an animal. I tried not to think too much about it, but the feeling lingered. Around late afternoon, I reached a small ridge that overlooked a valley. The view was beautiful, with sunlight hitting the tops of the distant hills and shadows stretching across the forest floor below. I stopped to take it in, leaning on my trekking poles, and then decided to continue along the trail, planning to find a suitable campsite before nightfall. That was when I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been relatively clear, now seemed to vanish into a thick tangle of trees and underbrush. I stepped carefully, looking for any indication of the path, but there was nothing. My map indicated that the trail should continue straight, yet I could see nothing but trees and shadows. I tried backtracking a few steps, hoping to find a marker I had missed, but the ridge made it difficult to see far ahead. My sense of direction was telling me to trust the compass, but my instincts were warning me to be careful. I took a deep breath and moved slowly, making deliberate steps, my eyes scanning for any kind of trail marker. It was at that moment I heard it, a low, rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't fast and it didn't sound like a human, but it was close. I froze, trying to pinpoint the direction. The noise stopped as quickly as it started, leaving me in a heavy silence again. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but there was nothing. My heart rate accelerated, and I realized that even though I was experienced, the isolation of the place was affecting me more than I wanted to admit. I reminded myself that this was the wilderness, that animals made noises all the time, and that there was nothing here that could hurt me if I stayed calm. I checked my watch. It was approaching 6 in the evening, and the sun was already dipping behind the hills. I needed to find a campsite soon or risk hiking in the dark, which would make the situation far worse. I continued, keeping my pace steady and deliberate. After a short while, I spotted what looked like a flat area with a small clearing. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I set my pack down, dug through my bag for my tent, and began setting it up. As I worked, I kept listening for any unusual sounds, noticing how the wind moved through the trees differently here, how shadows shifted with the fading light. By the time the tent was up and my sleeping area prepared, the sky had darkened significantly, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the ridges. I cooked a simple meal over my portable stove, eating quietly, aware of every sound around me. There was the distant call of an owl, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the constant whisper of the wind through the trees. Nothing else. I reminded myself that everything was normal, that I was safe as long as I stayed alert. After finishing my meal, I organized my supplies and made sure my flashlight and headlamp were within reach. I slipped into my sleeping bag, the night sounds of the forest surrounding me, and tried to sleep. Sleep did not come easily. Every small sound made me tense. Every shadow seemed larger than it should have been. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps nearby, but when I shined my flashlight into the trees, there was nothing. I kept the light close, imagining scenarios, thinking through what I would do if an animal or a person was really nearby. It was a mental exercise, and eventually, the tension eased enough for me to drift off, though not fully into restful sleep. I was still aware of every subtle movement and sound, waiting for the dawn. I woke early the next morning, the first light of sunrise spilling through the trees. The forest looked completely different in the light, with colors vivid and details clear. I packed up quickly, eager to put distance between myself and the unsettling ridge from the previous day. I followed my compass and map, moving carefully, noting landmarks along the way. Hours passed, and the terrain became more challenging, with steeper climbs and rocky areas. I focused on keeping my energy up, eating snacks, drinking water, and taking small breaks to rest and observe my surroundings. The forest felt more alive in the daylight, with birds calling, insects buzzing, and small animals scurrying in the underbrush. I still felt a lingering edge of unease from the previous night, but the daylight made it easier to trust my senses and instincts. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a narrow ravine. The trail dropped sharply, with loose rocks and uneven footing. I moved slowly, testing every step, using my trekking poles to steady myself. Suddenly, my foot slipped on a loose stone, and I tumbled down a short slope, hitting my shoulder and scraping my leg. I cursed under my breath, checking for serious injuries. The cuts were superficial, but my shoulder throbbed, and I realized I needed to be more careful. I rested for a few minutes, assessing my injuries, then carefully continued, moving slower and taking deliberate, calculated steps. The ravine seemed endless, and the path became increasingly difficult, with rocks and fallen trees blocking the way. My energy was draining faster than I had anticipated, and I knew I had to find a safe place to stop soon. By late afternoon, the terrain leveled slightly, and I spotted a small creek running through a shallow valley. I followed it, hoping to find a flat area for my next campsite. As I moved along the water, I noticed fresh tracks in the mud. They were large, clawed footprints, unmistakably from a bear. My stomach dropped. I stopped and surveyed the area, noting signs of recent activity: broken branches, disturbed dirt, and flattened vegetation. I remembered everything I had read about bear encounters. Stay calm, don't run, make yourself look big, back away slowly. I kept my eyes on the forest, scanning for any sign of movement, and continued along the creek, keeping a safe distance from the tracks. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows, and I felt the weight of isolation pressing down more heavily than ever. I knew I needed to find shelter before dark, but every step forward felt more precarious. I finally found a small clearing with enough flat ground to pitch my tent, away from the creek but still close enough to hear the water. I worked quickly, setting up my shelter and arranging my gear. I made a small fire. I had been planning this hike for months, going over every detail I could think of, from the trail map to my gear, and even contingency plans in case something went wrong. I was always cautious, careful to pack enough food, water, first aid supplies, and extra clothing for sudden weather changes. My goal was to hike a trail I had never attempted before, a remote stretch of wilderness that promised isolation and rugged terrain. I liked that. I liked the challenge, the feeling of being completely on my own, relying solely on my knowledge, experience, and instincts. The morning I started, the air was crisp and cool, the sky pale and clear, giving the entire forest a delicate glow. I remember noticing how quiet it was, the occasional chirp of birds breaking the silence, the soft rustle of leaves as a mild breeze brushed through the trees. I set off on the trail with a careful pace, focusing on my breathing, keeping an eye on my surroundings, the uneven ground, and the occasional slippery rock or loose soil. I was alert, but not anxious. I liked being alert. It made me feel alive. The trail started easy enough, following a narrow dirt path through dense woods, with sunlight filtering through the canopy in scattered golden beams. I noted the types of trees, the patterns of moss, the small tracks of animals I occasionally saw crossing the path. Rabbits, squirrels, maybe deer. Nothing unusual yet, just the normal signs of life in a forest. I enjoyed documenting these things mentally. It helped me stay focused, aware, and grounded. After a few hours, the terrain began to change. The path became steeper, rockier, and more isolated. There were no signs of human presence. No litter, no footprints, nothing except the occasional cairn I had passed earlier, marking the trail. I paused at one point, taking a long drink of water, wiping sweat from my brow, and looking around. The forest was beautiful, but I noticed how the trees became denser, the sunlight dimmer. I could feel the temperature drop slightly as shadows grew longer. It was still early afternoon, but the forest seemed to absorb the light differently here. I reached a narrow ridge that overlooked a valley, and the view was incredible. I could see the trail snaking down into the valley and rising again on the other side. I had to navigate this ridge carefully. The rocks were loose, and a slip here could have been dangerous. My pack felt heavy, and I took a moment to adjust it, making sure everything was secure. I drank more water, checked my compass, and continued. As the afternoon went on, I noticed something odd. The forest, once alive with birds and small animals, had gone silent. No birdsong, no rustling, not even the scurry of a squirrel. The only sounds were my boots crunching against the gravel and the wind brushing through the trees. At first, I thought it was normal. Sometimes forests go quiet, especially in isolated areas. But then I started hearing faint sounds behind me. At first subtle, like sticks snapping under small feet, then a little louder, as if someone or something was following. My heartbeat quickened, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I had been alone in the woods many times before. It could be a deer, a small animal, even the echo of my own steps bouncing off the rocks. I increased my pace slightly, keeping my eyes scanning the surroundings. The path was narrow and winding, with cliffs on one side and dense undergrowth on the other. Every so often, I turned my head, expecting to see nothing, and most of the time I did. But every so often, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large moving quickly through the trees. My heart jumped each time. I reminded myself to stay rational. Maybe it was a deer, maybe it was a bear moving silently. I had a bear spray in my pack and knew how to handle wildlife encounters. Still, unease began to grow. The movement behind me seemed persistent. Not random, not like a deer, but calculated, deliberate. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the trail ahead. I checked my phone for GPS signal. None. Not even a hint of reception. I wasn't surprised. This part of the forest was notoriously isolated. I took a deep breath and kept moving, my pace steady but cautious, listening carefully for sounds. Every crackle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a shiver down my spine. I reached a section of the trail that climbed steeply along a cliff face. The rocks were jagged, sharp, and slick with moisture from a recent rain. I moved carefully, testing each foothold before putting my weight down. I was aware of the possibility of falling, of twisting an ankle, of sliding down the cliff. Every step required full attention. The wind picked up here, strong enough to feel in my chest, forcing me to lean slightly into it to maintain balance. Then I heard it clearly. A branch snapping behind me, very deliberate, not like an animal's clumsy movement. I froze, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for the source. Nothing visible. My pulse raced. I considered turning around, but the cliff made it risky. Moving backward could mean a misstep. I decided to keep moving forward slowly, careful not to make unnecessary noise. Every sense was heightened, every muscle tense. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was another hiker, but the trail was remote, and I hadn't seen anyone else that morning. Perhaps a hunter? That seemed unlikely but possible. Still, the feeling of being watched followed was strong. It wasn't just a fleeting anxiety. It was primal, deep in my bones. I moved faster, though carefully, eyes darting to every shadow, listening to every sound. I reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. I knelt to drink some water and to catch my breath. The sun was low now, casting long shadows. I thought about stopping, resting for a few minutes, maybe setting up a small campsite for the night. But the sense of being followed, of something tracking me, made me hesitant. I didn't want to stay in one place. As I started walking again, I noticed more signs. Footprints, not mine, fresh in the mud near the stream. Large, human-shaped. My heart pounded. I had no idea who or what could be out here. The trail continued up a steep incline toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. I knew if I reached higher ground, I would have a better view and possibly a chance to escape or signal for help. I moved cautiously, glancing back frequently. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky had turned a deep orange, the kind of evening light that stretched shadows and made the forest look even more foreboding. I stopped to rest, scanning the valley below. The trail wound down into dense forest, impossible to see beyond a few meters. I saw no one, no movement, nothing. My breathing slowed, but my nerves were still frayed. I realized I had to make a decision. I could either descend into the valley to try to find the main trail or continue along the ridge in hopes of finding a road or clearing. Staying still wasn't an option. If someone was following me, I needed to put distance between us. I chose the ridge, keeping close to the edge where I had better visibility. Night began to fall. The temperature dropped quickly. The wind picked up, and darkness settled into the forest. I used my headlamp, scanning ahead for obstacles. The ridge was narrow in places, with steep drops on either side. I moved slowly, carefully placing each foot, aware that one slip could be fatal. The headlamp illuminated twisted roots, loose rocks, and low branches. Every sound, wind through the trees, my own footsteps, felt amplified. Then I heard it again, unmistakable. A crunch of leaves, closer this time, and then another. Not like an animal, but deliberate. My mind raced. I had to stay calm, rational. I considered climbing down into the trees to hide, but the slope was steep, dangerous. I decided to keep moving, sticking to the ridge, using the higher ground to my advantage. Hours passed like this, step by step, careful, alert, exhaustion growing. My muscles ached. My hands were scraped from gripping rocks, my face cold and sweaty. I drank sparingly, ate a small amount of food, kept moving. The night was dark, quiet except for the wind and occasional distant sounds of wildlife. I kept my headlamp on at all times, scanning constantly. Eventually, as dawn began to break, the forest started to lighten. I reached a small clearing where the ridge opened up into a broader trail, one that led toward a road I had marked on my map. Exhausted, I moved carefully but with purpose, aware that I was finally out of the most dangerous part of the terrain. I checked the area, saw no signs of anyone following. The footprints from the previous day were gone, washed away or hidden by weather. Couldn't tell. I descended slowly, cautious but aware that help or at least civilization was near. The road appeared eventually, a small dirt path connecting to a larger forest road. I kept moving until I saw a car parked on the side. Relief washed over me like a physical wave. I approached the car, unlocked it, and collapsed inside. I was shaking